went global. So it makes perfect sense that as the international cannabis trade was established, so it would be been hippies in South Africa, by whatever definition, that contributed to the growth in the trade from South Africa globally.
Would there have been any connection between that growth and links by white South Africans to Europe?
Well, just anecdotally, it seems that looking at newspaper reports over the years, the places that speak about South African cannabis are largely the Netherlands and the United Kingdom. With those two countries, we do know that there are ancestral connections between white South Africans and those countries. So it makes sense that there was an ancestral connection between the people who were smuggling and where they were taking the cannabis.
Paragraph 2.1.18. Internationally, certain South African strains of cannabis, such as Durban Poison and Swazi Gold, became famous and in high demand. The flourishing of these strains and the enormous growth of the South African cannabis trade in general was largely due to an unintended consequence of the apartheid regime, in that the apartheid regime removed control over vast areas of land through the Bantustan system, whereby many rural areas were then free to cultivate large tracts of cannabis.
If you look at the areas where cannabis is grown, and where historically there's been a large amount of production in the 20th century, corresponds quite closely with the Bantustan system. The reasoning behind that would be that these are rural areas where cultivation has continued for centuries. You can see that from the pre-colonial evidence. And we can also assume that there was, with the Bantustan system, a massive underdevelopment of those areas, which means that the people in those areas would have been seeking ways of bringing in themselves an income. And cannabis was a very easy thing to grow there. So if we look at, when I say Bantustan system, I don't just mean the apartheid government's homeland policy and these pseudo-independent states that they created, but I include Lesotho and Swaziland in that, the labor reserves, if I can call them that. Massively underdeveloped areas that really needed money. And because of the level of underdevelopment, there was a very lax policing of those areas. So it was very easy to grow cannabis there. And yeah, I think that's all I'm really saying in that paragraph.
2.1.19. Since the dismantling of the apartheid state system, not much has changed in respect to the legislatures and the South African Police Service's views on cannabis, despite the bony maws of society becoming far more drug liberal during this time.
Well, I think that's a straightforward statement. Not much has changed with the legislation around cannabis until very recently. It hasn't really been discussed as something that needs to change until very recently. And the bonhomos of society do appear to have become more open to changes in drug laws and more drug liberal in the approach. I don't think there's anything problematic there.
Over the page, 846, paragraph 2.1.20. Certainly it can be said that a growing number of cannabis users are seeking and obtaining access to, in some instances, internationally sourced cannabis. I think that should be through a well-established.
Yes, that should be through. Yes.
Through a well-established trade, despite enforced prohibition. This at times and increasingly funds in part violent criminal enterprises.
Again, that's you can find this out by simply looking at a number of newspaper articles over the last 20 years. Not much controversial in that statement. I don't think I have anything to add to it.
And then in paragraph 2.2 you give your conclusions. You could take us through those. The first is often forgotten that a substance which is illegal was not always so. presume that ties up to the next one, which is the history of the prohibition of cannabis does not find ground in rationality, reason, science, or good lawmaking, but rather in racism, irrationality, social Darwinism, poor politics, and non-science.
People often presume, when not just looking at cannabis, but with a number of historical constructions and phenomena, I mean, the nation state itself is a good example, that people take it as a given, and they forget that it was historically constructed and created, that borders weren't always where they are. And the same applies to drugs, that we see, especially after the 1960s, that cannabis should be illegal is largely taken as a given by states, often invoking the international law that requires them to keep it illegal. So I think a lot of what I've tried to do is show that, you know, we can't forget that something that is illegal now was always illegal. We have to look at our history, understand how these things that we take as given were not always so. As for 2.12, say the prohibition of cannabis does not find ground in rationality, reason, science, or good lawmaking, I think that that's a fair statement considering the evidence I've put forward today.
Point 3, with the momentum of the war on drugs, in quotes, and apartheid-style thinking, certainly in South Africa, legislators and enforcers of prohibition neglected or forgot the need to rationally justify their prohibitory policies and laws.
I think that that's a fair deduction that I've made simply from what I've mentioned, that there was no need to justify, and because at a certain point it just becomes easier for the state, when they're asked about why this is illegal, they can give a quick and solid reason. They don't really need to think about it. I'm not saying that that was always happening or that they didn't offer other reasons. I mean, I've gone through the evidence and explained how ideas of insanity and moral degeneration and fears of resisting authority, as in the case of the hippie cult, also some references to that in the RICAD document, how these were used to justify prohibition, but by and large, they didn't need a reason to justify prohibition after a certain point, because they had international obligations that they could invoke, which would answer the question without any hassles. Yeah.
Or at least partially and historically the source of such prohibition.
Yes, I think I've shown that quite clearly. Yeah.
So now we've been through the contents of your expert summary. Do you confirm that it is your evidence under oath?
I do confirm, taking into account the changes that I've to be made as I've gone through.
Indicated that you rely on chapters 1 and 2 of Annexure B.
Yes.
To your expert summary.
Yes.
Do you adopt the contents of chapters 1 and 2 of Annexure B for the purposes of your evidence?
Yes, I do. Chapters 1 and 2 specifically.
No further questions.
Thank you. Mr.
God, please.
Excuse me.
Mr. Peterson,
Yes, sir.
there are issues I wish to establish. You are still a student of history, not so?
Yes, sir.
You studying towards your PhD,
Yes, sir.
and this is your fifth PhD.
Yes.
Why is it taking you so long?
If you look at the statistics, I'm actually below average at the moment. 5 years is fine time to be working on a history PhD.
You have been presented by the plaintiffs as an expert witness.
Yes, sir.
What is your particular area of expertise, if any?
Beg your pardon?
If any.
I would say that my particular expertise lies in the colonial thinking and the way that colonialism created the world that we live in today.
Let's go to your PhD. Let's go back to your PhD studies. What is your topic on?
I'm looking at the development of a kind of traditional horse racing that's found in the former homeland areas of the Eastern Cape and a bit more broadly as well.
Yes. Let's go back to your claimed expertise. What are your core competencies?
I would say
as a student. Remember, you're still a student.
I would say that my main competencies are analyzing the manner in which the colonial world was constructed by the colonial government and the way that the colonial infiltration into Africa changed the society that it affected.
And you're still studying towards that?
Yes.
Do you have any particular area of practice?
I beg your pardon?
Do you have any particular area of practice?
Could you describe what you mean by area of practice?
Are you practicing history or anything like that?
Yes.
In what way? Explain.
I am a practicing historian.
Where do you practice?
At Rhodes University.
As what?
As a lecturer, and I do research work where I'm asked to do research work.
As a contract lecturer?
Yes.
What is that?
It's a person who is hired to lecture at the university. It simply means that I'm not on a permanent position. It's a labor technicality, I would say.
Paper, your makes you an expert?
In certain aspects, yes.
Which aspects?
In what I've covered in chapters 1 and 2. I've continued working on, and the ideas that I cover there, I've continued working on since then.
Only the first 2 chapters?
I would say, yes.
Confidence in your whole composite thesis?
I wouldn't say I don't have confidence. I would say that the rest of the thesis and the time that I was writing it, my understanding of oral history methodologies was not what it is now. I believe that I would need to reconduct the analysis. I may come to the same conclusions, but if I said to the court that I could stand by everything in chapter, it may mean that I was misleading the court. So if I reconducted that analysis, perhaps I would stick by everything that I've written there. Otherwise, I think I would make the changes, and then I could say with what I say in chapters 3 and 4.
So you may also come to a different conclusion in chapters 3 and 4?
Yes.
And your Master of Arts thesis, major piece of work thus far?
Well, yes, I would say so. It's what I did for my master's degree. Well, there's the work I did on traditional horse racing, and there's the work I did for the UNDP.
No, but what have you published, other than that singular article you refer to summaries?
Well, the Eastern Cape government and the Gambling Board on traditional horse racing, and the work I did for the UNDP.
What have you published? Let's get there. Look at your summaries, maybe.
No, I don't need to look at the summaries. The work that I did for the Eastern Cape Gambling and Betting Board was published as a report, as was the work I did for the United Nations Development Programme.
In which publications?
They are listed there.
Go back to them, show us.
Well, the status of traditional horse racing in the Eastern Cape.
Where are you reading from?
I'm reading from my CV.
Yes, what paragraph?
3, 4, 5, paragraph 5 of 848.
But it says nothing about publication.
It was published.
Do you want to read it?
I was a senior researcher on the Rhodes University Research Office research project, the status of traditional horse racing in the Eastern Cape, commissioned by
Nothing.
the Eastern Cape Gambling and Betting Board.
Yes. Published. At least you don't say.
Well, I don't state it explicitly. I'll give
Where
you
was
that.
it published?
It was published by the Eastern Cape Gambling and Betting Board of their research.
Where was it published?
I'm not sure where it was printed, but it was a publication. I have a copy of the publication.
In which publication was it published?
It was published as a special report.
What publication is that? If I need to
The
access
publication
it, please listen,
is the
Mr.
status of traditional horse racing in the Eastern Cape. That is the publication. I'm not sure what more you want from me.
Yes, where? I want to access it. Where do I go?
Well, you could look on the Eastern Cape Gambling and Betting Board website. They have a PDF version there. There's also on the Rhodes University Research Office website. Alternatively, I could arrange for a hard copy to be delivered.
So it was published on the website.
No, it was published in one.
What is your other publication?
There was the publication of the Old Worlds for New that I did, which was said here, published in the Proceedings of the Law Conference 2015.
Where are you reading? What paragraph?
The paragraph above it. It's chronologically arranged.
Yes, that's the singular publication I referred to.
Well, that was the publication.
Yes. And that's a singular article that was published by yourself.
Well, it's a conference proceeding, yes.
You see, I'm asking you all these questions because we're going to submit that you are not an expert of any shape or form to be able to can assist this court on the issues that are before this court. Do you have any comment?
Yes. I was asked to come to this court and discuss the process of prohibition. I've come to this court and I've discussed the process of prohibition. I'm not a lawyer, and what the court does with that information is not my concern. And what you argue about this information is not my concern either. But I have come to offer the court material that I've been told may be of, and I've done that.
Yes, in our submission, you're not an expert. Okay. Let's move to the second issue. In our submission, your evidence before this court, including your thesis, has some unfortunate racial overtones. And I'll summaries, you do not refer to any book or work or publication or history of black people. Or is that correct?
Are you referring to my thesis?
Let's start with your summaries.
Oh, with the summary.
Shanok,
Yes, that's true.
page 839. Jutoi, obviously not a black person.
I wouldn't say obviously. I think that's very presumptuous, but you are correct in this case.
Mills,
He's Scottish, yeah.
Deacon,
Deacon is the UCT, yeah, I believe it is a white woman, yes.
Yes. McCullough?
Male, yes, white male.
Yes. Let's go to your thesis.
All right.
In your thesis, you have some 77 citations
Yes.
that you relied on
Where
by
exactly
individuals at the end of your thesis.
Okay. Do you mean my bibliography and reference?
Yes, exactly.
Yes, yes,
Yes.
all right.
Yes.
Okay. So
There are about 70.
985, correct?
Yes, yeah.
Yes.
There are about 77 citations or references.
Yes.
Of course, some of them are repeated. But you
no,
cite them.
none of them will be repeated. That's the point of a reference system.
No, I mean the names.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yes. 27 citations are black or African.
I've got no idea.
Is there any black person there?
I've got no idea.
Go through. Take your time.
Hard to tell the race of someone by their name, but I do know some of them, and I'm pretty sure that I cite Mr. Professor Kepe here. Professor Kepe. Now, I'm sorry, what is the relevance of...
It's very relevant.
Well,
Or rather, the prohibition of cannabis is based on some racist or apartheid history.
Yes. So is the composition of our academic world, with academic articles, to be overwhelmingly written by white people.
Why?
Because we were an apartheid state. Because during the apartheid state, there was chronic underdevelopment of different... was that were full of white people. Of course, the people who were writing about South Africa at the time would have been largely white. If I didn't use these, then we wouldn't have to work with. Black people had to be included is actually ridiculous because there weren't any writing about it.
How do you tell a history of without their engagement?
I've not tried to tell the history of a people.
What were you telling?
I was writing about the processes of prohibition and the processes of resistance.
Is that not a flaw?
No, that's not a flaw. That's a topic, sir.
Are you saying Africans cannot tell their own history?
No, and I never would say that, and I don't see how you could imply that I have.
Have you perhaps spoken to the kings and chiefs throughout the country?
What would be the relevance
about the
of that
history
for
of
this
cannabis?
topic? What would be the relevance of that for this topic?
About
when I'm looking at the process of prohibition...
You see, interrupting me. You ask me a question?
No, so please let me finish. So that, history is all about context. I must give you the context if I'm to properly inform the court of what I'm doing. Now, when we're talking about prohibition, we're talking about a state that was racist, we all accept that, and was white people. Now, when that state prohibited cannabis, it was white people that prohibited cannabis. Of the study, I would have achieved nothing by speaking to traditional leaders, as you imply.
They don't have a history to tell?
Well, of course they do. And since then I have spoken to a number of traditional leaders looking at other things, at their histories, at the way that their histories have developed and changed, and how the way that the apartheid government framed those histories was wrong. In fact, I do lecture on that a fair amount. But for the purposes of this study, what you're saying is patent.
Are you not being contemptuous of African people, telling their history without involving them?
No, I'm not telling the history.
You are.
I'm not. I'm telling the history of cannabis in South Africa.
Yes.
Yes, I do.
What did you mean by that?
I mean it was based on racist past.
Do you know how cannabis has been used by African people in this country?
I believe in Chapter 1 the description of the various ways in which it was used to establish the length of time over which it was used.
You didn't deem it relevant to speak to African people about
in this case, no. What I was doing was taking a synopsis of the written material over the years and simply that it had been used for a very long time. But that wasn't the focus of the study. It was simply to establish that it had been here for a long time and used for a long time. The exact technical ways in which it was used weren't particularly important. And frankly, resources that could be directed in a better way.
Where did you get that story from, that cannabis has been used for a long time in this continent and in this country?
I took it from a historical consensus that virtually every document written around cannabis agrees on that, and I outlined that data in my thesis.
Did you perhaps have a look at the Timbuktu manuscripts?
What relevance would me looking at the Timbuktu manuscripts have for understanding the processes of resistance to it in South Africa during the 20th century, after 1850? And you'll see the title of my thesis actually deals with 1850 until the present. Looking at the Timbuktu manuscripts would be a complete waste of my time.
Is that as you are of African history?
No, it's
a complete waste of time.
Question.
The Timbuktu manuscript will have informed you about the history of medicine, astronomy, and such subject in Africa.
I can't deny that.
If you bothered, you would have known. Let's move to a different point.
Right.
Your view is that the prohibition of cannabis should be lifted because that prohibition is based on apartheid. Are you listening?
I'm listening. I'm just making sure I understand the question by making notes. Yes?
Is that correct?
Are you asking me whether I believe that cannabis should be legalized because of this? Because of
I'm
what
asking you to confirm that is your view.
No, that's
not your view.
No, I've never said that.
Can you turn to page 846? Paragraphs 2.2.
Yes.
And the next paragraph, paragraph 2.2.1.2.
1.3, you mean?
The second paragraph, subparagraph.
Yes.
Can you read that?
The history of the prohibition of cannabis does not find ground in rationality, reason, science, or good lawmaking, but rather in racism, irrationality, social dominance, and science.
Yes. Confirm that. That's your view.
What I've written here in 2.12 is my view, yes.
Yes. And you say for that reason, the prohibition should be lifted.
No, I haven't said that.
Oh, you're not saying the prohibition should be lifted?
I'm not qualified to say whether it should be lifted. I'm a historian. I make a historical statement there.
What is your proposition then before this court?
My proposition is that the history of the prohibition of cannabis does not find ground in rationality, reason, science, or good lawmaking, but rather in racism, irrationality, social Darwinism, poor politics, and non-science.
Did you just read that same paragraph?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Yeah.
And your claim as a history student is that there is no science behind the prohibition?
No, that's not what I say.
You want to read that again?
The history of the prohibition of cannabis does not find ground in rationality, reason, science, or good lawmaking.
Yes.
Yeah?
So the prohibition you claim is not based on science?
The prohibition was not based on what today we would consider good science.
So why did you deny that? I asked you a moment ago.
Well, you asked me if there was any current science about whether prohibition should stay illegal, and I can't answer that question. What I can answer is that the initial reasons why cannabis was made illegal was not based on science that today we would find acceptable.
As a historian, not as a scientist.
No, not as a scientist, but I think you would agree that it was racist, and racist science would not be considered today as good science.
Of course, Mr. Patterson, you're not trained in science, are you?
No.
And you will not argue against scientists
No.
on the issues of harm caused by cannabis, would you?
No, no. I'm a historian. I'll stick to the history.
So your claim in paragraph 2.2.1.2 cannot stand.
I disagree with that.
Why?
Because I'm discussing the reasons why cannabis was initially made illegal, and I'm not contesting any of the science that exists now. That's not for me to decide. But as far as looking at the history goes, as a historian, I can speak to that.
I'm going to refer you, just to kill this point, to two scientific reports that are before this court. File number 2. Do you have file number 2 there?
File number 2 is 2 of 6.
Page 186.
Okay.
Are you there? Are you there?
Yes. Are you referring to the Home Office report?
Yes, yes.
Yes, yes.
In particular, at page 193,
193.
paragraph 4.3.
Paragraph 4.
Point
Sorry,
three.
what was it?
4.3.
4.3. Acute
Page
health
193.
risks
Are
of
you at
cannabis.
page? Yes.
Yes.
You want to argue against that, would you?
I've got no idea. I'm a historian.
Yes. It's a different thing not to have an idea than not being able to argue against that. What that paragraph says, just to summarize, is that cannabis does cause harm. Would you accept that? Coming from scientists?
Including Professor Matt.
I'm not here as a scientist. I've got no idea how to weigh up what is good science and what is not. That's for the scientists to argue about and the court to decide.
Mr. Patterson, this is a simple question. Would you argue against that? Yes or no?
It's not a simple question, because what you're asking me to do is that I've come here to speak about a certain thing, and you're saying, will you speak about something that I'm not qualified to speak about?
Yes, but would you dispute that? If scientists tell you that cannabis does cause harm, would you argue against that?
I would look at the various studies involved. I certainly wouldn't develop a professional opinion on it.
There's one of the studies I'm referring you to.
One of the studies amongst thousands, I presume. But then again, I'm not familiar with medical literature or what's involved in that. I'm not willing to take a stand on what the health risks or benefits are. I thought that's why someone like Professor Nutt was here.
You're being evasive, Mr. Patterson.
I'm not
on
being
a simple
evasive. I've
issue.
been asked to make a statement about something I know nothing about.
Yes, I'm asking you, would you argue against that? Yes or no?
Would I argue against the fact that I know nothing about what you're speaking about?
As a history student, would you argue against scientists who tell us that cannabis does cause harm?
Would I argue against scientists who tell us that cannabis does cause harm? No. Nor would I argue against scientists who say it does not, because I'm not a scientist.
My Lord, we're going to argue about this witness and his conduct.
Yes, I
later.
think it should be left for argument.
May I put this away?
Maybe not as yet.
All right then.
I told you that that report or article refers to acute health risks of cannabis. You noted that?
Yes.
Yes. Would you read any apartheid or racist approach in that scientific report?
No, I haven't read it.
Go to page 193. Are you there?
Yes, I'm on 193.
Can you read paragraph 4.3.2?
Cannabis produces dilation of some blood vessels and leads to constriction. The characteristic redness of the eye shortly after exposure is due to dilatation of the conjunctival blood vessels. More problematically, it consists of other blood vessels leading to an increase in blood pressure. Cannabis can also disrupt the control of blood pressure, leading to lower standing blood pressure and increased risk of fainting. Cannabis also produces an increase in heart rate. Maximum increases in heart rate occur within 15 to 30 minutes of inhalation and remain raised for 2 hours or more. Tolerance to the cardiovascular effects of cannabis occurs with repeated use.
Read the next one, 4.3.3.
The cardiovascular actions of cannabis are similar to the effects of exercise and probably do not constitute a significant risk in healthy adolescents and young adults. They can, though, be dangerous in people with diseases of the cardiovascular system, especially those with coronary artery disease, irregularities of heart rhythm, high blood pressure, or individuals at risk of stroke.
You understand that?
It seems fairly straightforward, yes?
Oh. Has that got anything to do with apartheid or racist past, that scientific finding?
No?
Do you accept that South Africa is now a democracy?
Yes, I do.
And do you accept that in a democratic state, the state has a legitimate interest in protecting the public against harm, including harm caused by cannabis?
Yes, I don't see anything wrong with that statement.
Having accepted that, it's going to be a submission at the end, and you may comment on this, that the history of the prohibition of cannabis is irrelevant when regard is had to the harms caused by cannabis, particularly to individuals, to families, communities, and the society. Do you have any comment?
Only to restate that I'm a historian talking about the history, and I've been asked to come here and talk about that process of prohibition, which I've done. What the court does with that information is up to the court.
Yeah. Mr. Peterson, what is your knowledge of the permitted use of cannabis currently in the country?
What is my knowledge?
Of the permitted use of cannabis
I know
under the current legislation.
I know that it's a prohibited substance. I believe that we are opening the way for medicinal use through Parliament. I believe there's some changes happening in various acts, but that's not a historical question.
No, there is no complete prohibition of cannabis currently. Would you accept that?
I'm not sure of the legal position right now. I am not a criminologist, nor am I a lawyer. I would say that in effect, cannabis is prohibited in South Africa.
In fact, it can be prescribed for medicinal purposes under the current Act, the Medicines and Related Substances Act. Would you accept that?
Like I say, I'm not a lawyer. I will check the law on that. It's not a historical question. I'm not open to dispute it.
In your summaries, you do not state the extent to which the prohibition should be lifted, or do you?
No, I've never stated to what extent I think the prohibition should be lifted. I don't think that's a question for historians to answer. I think that part of the reason these proceedings are happening is in order for the court to decide what should happen.
But why now do you answer questions that relate to the history of cannabis that is not based on science? We find that in your conclusion.
Yes, that's my conclusion as a historian. Yes. Once again, as I've said before, when I speak about the prohibition of cannabis not be based on science, I speak specifically about the moment of prohibition, that time when cannabis was prohibited. And I'm in no way referring to the current regime of prohibition that's happening in South Africa. That's not my question to answer.
Just to complete on this point, can I refer you to file 3?
File 3?
Yeah. Page 693.
Yeah.
It's Annexure H, my lord.
Would
693.
Yes. The UN report,
Yes.
country profile.
Yes.
Yeah.
You said you did some work with the United Nations.
Well, with the development program, not the Office on Drugs and Crime. It's a completely separate.
Yes. Is that not part of the United Nations?
Yes, it is part of the United Nations, but working for one unit of the United Nations
Yes.
doesn't imply that you work for any other unit.
Can you turn to page 699? Are you there?
I am.
This is an executive summary of a document compiled by the United Nations in respect of South Africa.
Yes.
Yes. If you look at the executive summary, it discusses the issue of drugs. Can you see that? Right at the top?
I see that.
Yeah. And it says South Africa in the regional context. Don't worry, I'll read that for you. South Africa is by far the largest market for illicit drugs entering Southern Africa. You wouldn't argue against that, would you?
I have no evidence to argue against that.
Yes. Let's go to the second point, consumption trends. Are you there?
Yes.
It reads, cannabis is the most prevalent illicit drug used in South Africa. Mandrax is the second commonly used illicit drug. Would you argue against that?
I'm not a criminologist, nor do I work in this field.
Would you argue against that? Yes or no?
No, I wouldn't argue against that. I'm not qualified to.
Let's go to the third point, ethnic segmentation. Although increasing social ethnic integration is evident, the drug consumption markets of South Africa remain ethnically differentiated. the extreme income inequalities between the different broad ethnic segments affect drug affordability and thus consumer choice. You won't argue against that, would you?
No.
Yeah. The next one, drug use and HIV/AIDS. Ongoing research in South Africa is demonstrating a link other than that related to injecting drug use between substance abuse and the spread of HIV/AIDS. You won't argue against that either.
I'm not qualified to argue against that. I'm a historian.
Yes. Prevention and treatment. Official funding for both prevention and treatment is very limited. The health and education sectors have been only minimally involved in prevention activities. The non-governmental community plays an active role in both sectors. There is currently no national program for primary prevention or awareness campaign. You can't argue against that. Coming from the United Nations.
I'm a historian.
Yes. The most important
I'm not
one.
sure why I'm being asked these questions. As
If you
a historian.
listen, you'll realize why.
Okay.
The last one, trafficking trends. The drug trafficking activities of organized crime groups are linked to numerous other criminal acts, ranging from car hijackings and robberies to the smuggling of firearms, stolen cars, endangered species, and precious metals. South Africa now features prominently in international drug trafficking networks. You won't argue against that?
No, not at all.
In the light of what I've just read to you, coming from the United Nations, would you accept that the government has a legitimate interest in preventing those harms that I read to you?
I would say that government has a legitimate interest in protecting society from harm, yes.
Thank you. Lastly, it's going to be our submission that your whole history that you testified around is irrelevant to the issues that are before this court. Do you wish to comment?
Well, yes, that's not for me to decide. I've been asked to come and present this before the court, and if it helps the court, I'm glad I did it. But I'm not a lawyer. I don't understand the process involved with this case. I'm an historian who was asked to present his views on why cannabis was prohibited in the first place. That's what I've done. And that's what I have to offer the court.
Good. Those would be the questions, my lord.
Thank you, Mr. Bufano.
Should I
Mr. Wood?
put this away?
As it pleases the court, my lord. I was thinking, my lord, that I would ask my seniors. I see there's only 1 hour left to cross-examine the witness. And I'm trying to figure out if it would be necessary to start with him now. Thank you.
Well,
To start with him now and then be...
Well, we have more than an hour. That's a lot of time today.
Thank you. Thank you, my lord. Mr. Patterson, I'm going to start at the end.
Right.
I'm going to start at your conclusion.
Yes.
Take you to page 846
Yes, I'm on it.
of file 4. Now, what I intend to do with these conclusions is to marry them specifically with the evidence that you have led before this court.
Okay.
Now, let us start at paragraph 2.2.1.2.
Sorry. That's now, which volume is that again that you are referring to?
File 4. Volume 4.
Volume
Volume 4. Thank you, my lord.
Page?
It's page 846.
844.
846.
846. Yes.
Now, I would like Mr. Patterson to go to 2.2.1.2.
Yes, I'm there.
Now, what I would like us to do for purposes of this paragraph is to try and decapitate it into different sections so that we can deal with it individually. Is that okay?
I'm not quite sure what you mean.
I'm saying we're going to cut this paragraph so that we don't have to deal with the whole statement at once. I'm going to deal with every aspect that you address in this paragraph.
I'm not sure if I can agree to that. The basis of it being not grounded on rationality, reason, science, and good lawmaking relies on it being racist, irrational, based on social Darwinism and non-science. So if we divide that the statement into two, then the first statement becomes meaningless. It must exist as a whole. I don't think we can divide it.
Mr. Patterson,
Yes, ma'am.
are you saying that rationality, reason, science, good lawmaking, racism, irrationality mean the same thing?
No, not saying that at all. Perhaps I don't understand what you're saying. Are you saying that we should divide it up and look at the connection between rationality and irrationality, racism and reason? My issue would be looking at, if I was, for example, to have written this in two sections, you could consider, I would say, the history of the prohibition of cannabis does not find ground in reason, rationality, science, and good lawmaking. And that statement alone doesn't convey the context required to understand of what I've said here.
Mr. Patterson,
Yes.
we have the whole statement and the court has the full statement in front of it.
Okay.
Now, what I'm going to do is interrogate all the aspects to which you allude for purposes of making this conclusion.
All right. I just asked to be allowed to provide the context involved with it. Context is important. It's the foundation of history.
What I would suggest, sir, is that you allow counsel to put the question. And if you're not sure or don't understand what it is, you can ask for clarification.
Yes, Mr.
Because otherwise you're not going to get any further here.
I'm indebted to my lordship. Mr. Patterson, let's start by going to rationality.
Yes.
You see, what is important for me to understand is what you understand by rationality. So that once you have given us what you understand by rationality, then we can interrogate it properly. What is your understanding and or your meaning of rationality in this context?
In this context, let's say, you say rational. Let's, if you don't mind, could we join rationality and reason? Because I think that they're largely the same thing. That there are sensible and commonsensical deductions that we make about society and the way that we reason based on our current social position. That is something that is considered rational by society and reasonable by society would be rationality and reason.
Okay. So what you're saying briefly is that what is rational and reasonable is what is sensible coupled with common sense.
Yes,
And I'm drawing from the actual phrases that you've just used.
No, I've got no problem with that statement.
Okay.
As long as we include in the current situation, in the 21st century where we stand today.
Well, Mr. Patterson, I'm happy with what you are saying, but I would like to understand something. How did you come to this test of rationality that you now refer to?
I would say that no test was required. That if we look at how society has constructed the rationality and reason of today, it's fairly well accepted across society that some things are rational and some things aren't. Some things are reasonable and some things aren't. I think that would be common sense.
Your answer is that no test was required.
No test was required. It's common sense.
Thank you. Let's go on to science.
Yes.
You have considered a few times that you're not a scientist.
Yes.
And we accept nonetheless that you have ventured into the avenue of science.
That would depend what you meant by ventured into the avenue of science.
Mr. Pattinson, your conclusion says...
I do mention science, if that's
the
what you
reason why I wanted us to take this step by step is so that we don't cloud the entire argument, so that we can be able to take it one by one.
Yes.
Now, what you have done here, you say you refer us to science.
Yes.
And I'm saying earlier, you indicated that you are not a scientist.
Yes, that's true.
And from the questions that you were asked earlier, you indicated that you have no reason or no basis or no foundation to be talking about science because you are not a scientist.
Scientific material, yes, I would agree with you, but I don't think that it is a ridiculous statement that if a science is racist, it should not be considered good science.
I have
think
not
that
talked...
that's accepted across society. So when I say science there, I look at the science of time, and I don't think anyone would say that the science of the time was good science. You don't need to be a scientist to make that statement.
Mr. Patterson, let's maybe try and stick to the question that I'm addressing to yourself.
I did.
And I'm always laying this foundation so that we don't fall out of the scope of the question. To say, you have made numerous concessions that you're not a scientist. You cannot, in fact, you indicated that you are not going to go into anything that talks about science because you are not qualified to do so. You are here to testify as a historian.
Yes.
Now, do you agree with me, therefore, that your conclusion, insofar as it relates to science, has no foundation?
No, I don't.
You do not agree?
No.
We will argue, Mr. Patterson, that having had your own concessions that you have no business talking about science, that you had no reason whatsoever as well to draw a conclusion based on science. What is your comment to that?
My comment to that is that when I say I'm not a scientist, I mean I cannot interpret scientific data. I can, however, spot racism. I can spot irrationality in arguments. And social Darwinism is well known to have been discredited as a science. If the prohibition of cannabis, the history which I speak, is based on the social Darwinism, then I'm more than qualified to say that that is bad science.
Mr. Pat, let's go to good lawmaking. I assume, and I may be wrong, that you are not a lawyer.
No, I'm certainly not a lawyer.
Thank you. Now, when we talk about good lawmaking, do you have any idea what good lawmaking entails?
Again, I speak about that in a largely commonsensical way. To say good lawmaking, I presume that the law would be made for the good of society as we understand it today.
That is your understanding of good lawmaking?
Yes.
Now, saying to us that you're not a lawyer, you've never participated in lawmaking, have you, Mr. Patterson?
No, small bits of policy development, but no lawmaking, no.
Now, your conclusion to then say, and to come and put to us the issue of good lawmaking here, when you have no experience in lawmaking, you are not a legal practitioner, you have not participated in any lawmaking areas, you have actually no basis to do so as well. What's your comment to that?
I think I would have as much basis to say this as someone saying that implementing apartheid was not good lawmaking.
We are still coming to apartheid, Mr. Patterson. Let's stick to good lawmaking.
We'll get there, but I think what I'd like to say is that if we're talking about good lawmaking, the whole of society has a certain amount of say in what is acceptable and what's not. And what I argue is that the theoretical foundation that was used to implement apartheid law later was the same as the foundation that was used to prohibit cannabis. Now, if I'm going to talk about good lawmaking, I couldn't very well say that it was good lawmaking if that lawmaking was the same process that gave us apartheid.
What is your idea of good lawmaking?
Making laws for the good of the society that you're in.
Okay. And we're saying you do not know how that process unfolds.
Not today, no. Well, I have watched Parliament, but I'm not an expert in it by any means.
You're not an expert. Thank you very much. Mr. Patterson, let's go to the issue of racism.
Yes.
In your thesis,
Yes.
you refer quite a lot to issues of racism.
Yes.
And how that is intertwined with the fact that Dagga or cannabis is now illegal.
Yes.
Now, how do you define racism, at least in your understanding of the present and or past society, whichever one is easy?
I would say that it's a general view of differentiation between races and hierarchy, or the belief in a hierarchy of those races. So believing that one race is in any way superior to another would be racism.
Okay. Now, in the context of South Africa, which race was superior to another race?
No race was superior to another race, but there was the belief, certainly amongst the political classes and who were entirely white in the colonists, that white people were superior to other races.
Okay, so even though, of course, in your opinion, white people were not, but they were considered.
They considered themselves.
They consider themselves. So when we talk about racism, and if I'm understanding you correctly, when we talk about racism, we are talking about the privilege and differentiation of races as against the black populace and more advantageous to the white population.
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
We're saying that when you talk about racism, and I'm drawing from the words that you used to say
Yes, yes.
it meant a differentiation of races,
And a
where
belief in
one
superior-
race referred to as superior to the other, particularly as against the black population.
Not just against the black population, against any other racial groups as it was defined by the colonists.
Which other population are we talking about?
Well, the colored populations and Indian populations, as I discussed in my testimony.
Oh, okay, well, they're all black.
Oh, yes, in the current definition.
Indeed.
That has changed over time. That's a socially constructed idea itself. So.
Thank you. Now, if we then come to the merits of this case,
Okay.
and I would like to take you, volume 1.
Am I in volume 1?
Volume 1.
Okay. One,
I would like to take you to page 22, specifically.
22. It seems to be stuck. Excuse me a second here. Right, I'm on 22.
Page 22, thank you. Now, you did indicate in your summary that you have read the pleadings, you have seen them, and you have gone through them.
Yes, these are the pleadings, yes.
Thank you. Now, when we look at paragraph 13.3, I'll read in the record, it says the following. It is irrational for the following reasons. We are talking about the prohibition here. It is irrational for the following reasons. Then it goes into 13.3.3.1. 13.3.1. The legislative history of the prohibition of cannabis show that it has at all times been motivated by reasoning that denied the morals of indigenous African societies, relied on racist and imperialist notions of what medical and recreational substance use is acceptable. And let's leave it at that. Now, looking at the second part, which is 13.3.1.2,
Yes.
it somewhat seems to be intertwined with what you actually conclude in your thesis. Am I correct?
Yes, I would say it's intertwined in a way, yes.
I mean, it seems to have the same conclusion.
I think that that's a fair statement. If that's
It's a fair statement.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now, do you know the plaintiffs in this matter? Do you know the plaintiffs? Yes.
Yes, I know the plaintiffs.
You know the plaintiffs?
Yes, I know the plaintiffs.
Okay. Do you know what part of race the plaintiffs belong to?
Judging by looking at them, I'd say they're white.
I suspect so as well.
Yeah.
Now, if we say the plaintiffs are white, and here in these pleadings, and in your thesis, you are saying to us that the African people, through apartheid and racism, were denied the use and enjoyment of cannabis. And previously we have agreed to say that these people who were not allowed cannabis are blacks, and you said Indian, colored, and Chinese.
Well, and whites, but it wasn't an issue because very few whites used it, so it didn't become a
Mr. Patterson, if you may allow me to go back to what you said. Did you say whites are part of the people that were not allowed to have cannabis?
Well, yes, if something's illegal, no one's allowed to have it. The issue was that I think I know where you're referring to. When I was talking about the international legislation and...
No, Mr. Patterson, I'm not talking about that.
No, but I think that it was in that time that... perhaps tell me which statement you're referring to.
I'm referring you to
jog
the
my
question I
memory.
asked you earlier. And I
Okay.
said to you, based on what you meant by differentiation of the races, where one class of race was regarded as superior to
Yes.
another.
Yes.
That was the basis that we spoke about. And I asked you
It
which
was my
race...
definition of racism.
Say that again, Mr. Patterson.
Are you referring to my definition of racism?
Absolutely.
All right.
And then we agreed to the population that was disenfranchised by the so-called racism was the black population.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
Now, having agreed on that,
Okay.
I'm now bringing you to what we've now read. And I've said to you, do you know the plaintiffs? And you say yes. And you're saying, looking at them, it looks to you like they're white.
Yeah.
Now, if we are now looking at the basis of your thesis, or at least the majority of what you content in your thesis, that apartheid, racism, is what led to the African populace being disenfranchised, not allowed to enjoy cannabis. How do the plaintiffs fit in this picture?
They don't. I'm not here for the plaintiffs.
Thank you.
No, hang on. I think you've misinterpreted what I was saying.
How would I have
It's-
misinterpreted you, Mr. Patterson?
Like, this doesn't apply to the plaintiffs. I'm not here to talk about the plaintiffs. I'm not here for the plaintiffs. I'm here for the court. And all I've done is explain the processes behind prohibition.
Mr. Patterson.
I don't understand where any race of the plaintiffs is
Mr.
relevant
Patterson, when I
to
agree
the
with you
history
on a
of
statement that you
prohibition.
make, when I agree with you, it does not mean I'm interpreting you in any manner, which I have not said. When you say a statement, when you give an answer given, and I say thank you, it's because I intend to move on.
All
It
right.
does not mean I mean you mean anything else.
All right. Let's carry on.
Thank you. Now, I would like us to continue back to 2.2.1.2.
Yes.
And now we are at the...
Oh, hang on. I'm sorry. Back to this one. 2.2.1.2. Right.
Volume 4.
Yes.
Apologies. Now, we are back to irrationality, because we've now dealt with racism. Once again, we're going to go through this exercise to say, how do you define and understand irrationality as we have placed it here in your conclusion?
Again, I would consider that something socially constructed. I consider something to be rational if it doesn't meet the standards of rationality that we consider applicable today.
Okay, something is irrational if it does not meet the standard of rationality.
Oh, yes, it is circular, I acknowledge that. Yeah.
Okay. And in your
Again, it
previous
comes back to a common sense understanding.
common sense and sensibility.
Yes.
And we remember that your previous answer was that there's no test that is required in this case.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think what I said was a obvious statement.
So now what we're relying on is not a legal test, because there's no test that we're relying on, is what you view as a test or as an understanding of how you see rationality and or irrationality.
Well, it's certainly not a legal test, but it is bound by our culture and our society. And I think if something is considered irrational by me, it's not just because of my view of rationality, but this is something that is considered irrational by the broader academic community.
That's why there's a test, Mr. Patterson. That's why I was asking you if it is broader.
Oh, right. So you're saying, well, in that case, I would say my idea of rationality or irrationality would be based on my own view of it and the views of my colleagues in the academy.
Thank you. Now we continue to social Darwinism.
Mm-hmm.
Can you take us through that? How do we then define this for purposes of this conclusion?
Define social Darwinism. Well, I've discussed that at length.
Earlier, yes.
Yes. Social Darwinism is the application of Darwin's ideas of evolution by natural selection to society and social planning in order to try and make sense of it.
Sorry, I didn't hear the last part.
In order to try and make sense of society. So if you are using Darwinian theories and the idea of evolution by natural selection to society in a social sense rather than a biological sense, that would be social Darwinism.
Okay. Now, let's try to understand specifically what are we referring to here.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
We're talking about in my understanding of what the definition that you just gave us now,
Yes.
we're applying a particular social construct to society. Now, of course, we know there's broader
Of course
Sorry?
we know that. I'm sorry, continue.
I'm saying, of course, we know that when we talk about what social construct is imposed on a particular society is different. But now, I'm trying to narrow it down to understand how this refers to us when it comes to cannabis. Mm-hmm. Now, I need to understand, from your definition, how does cannabis find application?
I think I've outlined that already. That was part of my evidence. That social Darwinism allowed for the separation of different race groups. Through that separation, there was the idea that interracial contact was dangerous in itself. That meant that in that contact, the people lower down the hierarchy that society had established would pose a threat to those at the top, in this case the white colonists. And that threat was increased through the use of vices, because it was a moral configuration as well. What social Darwinism did was it provided an understanding that there was a threat posed by one racial group to another. And that threat was increased through the vices. And in order to minimize that threat, you would have things like the prohibition of cannabis or the prohibition of drinking by black people.
Okay, now let's. I'm glad you actually gave that example particularly.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you say this, you are in fact saying that cannabis was not a problem, and the white population was allowed to have cannabis, and it was not an issue.
You'd have to refer to a specific period in time. Yeah.
Let's talk about, remember in your evidence in chief,
Okay.
you indicated that
Yes.
pre the colonial era, or when the Europeans landed in Africa,
Yes.
that they brought cannabis with, in fact, they introduced cannabis and the smoking thereof.
I beg your pardon?
You indicated in your evidence in chief, if I understood you correctly, if I'm wrong, correct me, that when the Europeans came and settled in Africa, one of the habits that they introduced was the smoking of cannabis.
Oh, no, I didn't argue that at all. In fact, I argued the opposite.
Okay.
I argued that when Europeans arrived in Africa, it was already here.
It was already here. No,
Yes.
absolutely, it was already here. I agree. I agree. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Forgive me. Now, we then continue and we say, nonetheless, it was then turned and demonized, and black people were now told not to smoke cannabis.
No, I don't think it's
Hence the
that
apartheid-
straightforward.
Okay, let's go to your reference, Mr. Patterson. Let's go to where you referred us.
All right.
My Lord, if you may allow me just for... Just a second, please. Okay. I think I'm there, Mr. Patterson.
Which page should I refer to?
Okay, in fact, you actually referred us to 2.1.1, where you indicated originally that, of course, that cannabis was used all around the world. That was 2.1.1 of your summary.
I'm sorry, could you give me a page number there, please?
Your summary,
840.
840.
All right.
That's 2.1.1.
1. Yes?
Are you there?
Yes.
Now, you indicated that, of course, when Europeans arrived in SA, cannabis was already here.
Yes.
And, of course, you referred us to page 879 of your thesis, correct?
Yes, with the map, yes.
And, of course, you referred us to the map.
Yes, yes.
Now, when you went into the theory, that the social theory that you've now explained to us, you said that it emphasized, let's go to page 888, so that we can actually pick up on your statement exactly.
888.
888, yes.
Yes.
You referred us to actually to a reference there at the bottom.
Uh-huh.
That says there is evidence to suggest that these smoking games were almost synonymous with smoking cannabis in Southern Africa. Consider the words of Zulu chief in his testimony to the South African Native Affairs Commission. And then you referred us to the statement underneath that says, what is your opinion of this indiscriminate smoking of hemp by the Zulu? Would you like to see a law putting that down, as drink is put down? The old custom was the proper way, whereby the smoking of hemp was restricted to adults and grown-up men. Would you restrict it to grown-up men? Yes, because the adult is able to control himself. He takes a whiff of the pipe or the horn, and he passes spittle through a stick onto the floor, and makes figures. He passes on the horn to his next neighbor, but he does not use it to excess. The young people smoke it to excess, and they fight with adults, and they become mad through it, and rush away sometimes out of the huts like mad people. Would you like it restricted to adults? Yes. Those who can take a draw and amuse themselves by making figures on the floor and then pass the horn on. Now, after we went through this analogy that you gave us, I mean, I believe the understanding, yes, we can even read it, if you agree with me.
Which analogy are you referring to?
No, I mean, when we read these two paragraphs, the conclusion that we can
the
draw...
extract of the interviews, you mean?
Yes, the conclusion that you can draw here is that the Zulu chief was saying, this is bad. Okay, can we draw that analogy?
No.
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 Okay. How do you explain that?
Well, he's not saying that it's bad. He's saying that the old custom was the proper way. That the changes in the culture where the young people are now smoking it, that is bad. That's what he's saying. But certainly he says, would you like it restricted to adults? Yes. Those who take a draw. Simply restricting it to adults, that was what he saw as the proper way. So I don't think you could say that he was saying that the use of it was bad in itself. Not from this extract anyway. It would be a jump in inference. But he's talking about the change in the way that it's used rather than the use in itself.
Let's go back to that same paragraph, Mr. Patterson. I think maybe we are missing each other here on what is written. He says, the young people, the last two lines, the young people smoke it to excess, and they fight with others, and they become mad through it, and rush away sometimes out of their hearts like mad people.
Yes.
You are saying that this, what he is saying here, is to not say that the smoking of cannabis is bad.
Yes, I'm not saying that that's what he's saying. In fact, if you read this clearly and in context, when he refers to adults, that they're able to control himself, that they can simply take a whiff of the pipe or the horn. That implies that he has no problem with that. In fact, the line before that says the old custom was the proper way, whereby the smoking of hemp was restricted to adults and grown-up men. He clearly, when he refers to the proper way, is saying that that is a fine pastime. But his complaint is about the youth smoking it, not the adults. So to say that he's against the smoking of cannabis, just from looking at this statement, would be untrue. In fact, it implies that he has a problem with the youth smoking it, but doesn't have a problem with adults smoking it in the proper way, as he puts it.
Now, one more time.
Okay.
The chief says it makes young people mad. That's what he says.
Well, rush out of their huts
He says
people.
so in that says so in those exact same words. Says it makes them mad.
Well, he doesn't say it makes people mad. He says it makes them rush out of their huts like mad people. But yeah, I take your point.
Let's talk about adults.
Okay.
The last two lines on the page. Would you like it restricted to adults? The answer is yes. Those who take a straw and amuse themselves by making figures on the floor and then pass the horn on.
Yes.
The operative word being those who. Do you see that part?
Yes.
Do you accept that the others who do not do that?
Those who would be adults. Yes. Would you like it restricted to adults? Yes. They implied are those who can take a draw. That's how I would read it anyway.
No, you can read it slowly, please. It says, would you like it restricted to adults? The answer is yes.
Yes, yeah.
Those who take a straw and
draw.
amuse themselves by
Not
making figures
straw,
on the floor and then pass the straw.
You've said twice straw. No, it's draw.
Oh,
draw,
apologies,
yes.
apologies. Draw. I meant draw. Now, what this statement says, and I said, let's focus on the word those who. Do you acknowledge that there are other adults who do not do the same thing?
I don't think that's what he's speaking about, because he says an emphatic yes. Yes, those who take a draw, implying that those who take a draw and amuse themselves by making figures on the floor are the adults. There might be more to it, but certainly I don't think that the inference you're drawing is correct.
My Lord, I believe we'll deal with the clarity of what the statement means at the appropriate time.
Pardon?
I'm saying I believe we'll deal with what this interpretation means at an appropriate time, and not with the witness first.
Yes.
Now, I would like us to go back to your conclusion once again.
That's back to
846.
846.
At volume 4.
I'm there.
Now, we go into poor politics. What do you mean about poor politics?
Well, if I think about the way that cannabis is spoken about in the archives, many people were, when asked whether cannabis should be made illegal, would say no, it shouldn't. And their reasoning wasn't that it doesn't do any harm or any of these other reasons we've spoken about. But they would say, for example, that there have been a lot of oppressive laws passed lately, and I think that this would just irritate the minors, for example. There were other statements. If I can just think of a few. Times when people would say that it was completely unenforceable in the rural areas and passing the law would have absolutely no effect. And again, just to irritate people who used cannabis in the urban areas. So poor politics, I mean poor politics, that this law was essentially passed in a way that wasn't effective and was seen as something of an irritant.
So you're saying that poor politics means that the law was passed in a way that was not effective?
Well, I would say that probably is poor politics, yes. But I'm thinking in a more sort of subtle political way, I think, when I say this. That if they hadn't prohibited it, there would be people who weren't quite as annoyed by it.
I'm trying to understand, Mr. President. You are saying that poor politics means that the law was made in a way that was not effective. That is what you mean in this context.
I think that is poor politics. Yeah, I will accept that. Yeah, that is poor politics.
Well, I don't know if both have a connection, and I don't know how you connect the two.
To connect which two?
Poor politics and law being not effective.
Well, if you're putting in a law for political reasons, that political reason being that white colonists feel threatened by it, but the law isn't effective, and you're just placating a moral panic that's emerged at the time, I'd say that that's poor politics.
Now, let's look at the last one, non-science.
Non-science, yes.
I must accept, as you have already testified, that you're not a scientist.
Yes, that's true.
What do you mean by non-science?
I mean discredited science to a large degree. Things that...
Apologies, you mean?
Discredited science.
Discredited.
I would consider something non-science if it influences science, but it's clearly not a part of it. Things like having a moral category of person and using that as a scientific theory. I would apply the same thing to racism. Something that is racist and it's non-science. It's a political issue that infiltrates the science.
Here, for example, as being non-science.
Yeah.
And you are saying that it is what gets relied on to influence science, but it has no application whatsoever.
Has no what? I'm sorry?
No application to the science.
There's no place in science.
There's no place in science.
Yeah.
Now, you've made an example of racism, and you've referred to us racism here. Now, in the earlier cross-examination questions that you were asked, you were referred to paragraph 4.3 of the previous pleadings. I shall take you there if necessary, but I'm thinking just if I just remind you that...
If I've just read them, I'm sure they're in my head.
Yes, and the issue was having looked at the acute risks of cannabis.
Do you mean
racism,
the scientific reports that
indeed,
I was reading?
Indeed.
Yes.
And what you were referred to was the acute health risks of cannabis. And out of the risks that you read, there was no reference to racism.
Yes, I agree with that.
Now, are you saying that, in that context, can I then draw on the analogy based on what you've just said, that racism is non-science in this regard?
Yes, racism is non-science. It's a political
So we shouldn't
issue.
even be referring to it.
I beg your pardon?
We should not be referring to it because it has no basis and or application in science when it comes to cannabis.
And yet it is used, or it has been historically used, should I say. The non-scientific concepts have been used in the science involving cannabis. The statements that were read out, as I acknowledged, I didn't see any trace of racism in there or irrationality in there, but it has a sort of non-science like racism has been historically used.
Now, in your thesis that you have referred us to,
Yes.
you see, this might be a rather difficult exercise, or long, actually, not difficult.
Okay.
But I would have wanted to see if you can refer us to any research that you've done that tells us or gives us the basis for your decision on rationality, for example.
Okay.
Is there somewhere where you can refer us?
To a definition of rationality.
No, not definition.
Okay.
We've passed the definition. We've now understood what you mean by rationality in
Okay.
terms of your conclusion.
Yes.
Now, I'm saying, from the thesis that we are now relying on, is there anywhere at all that you refer us to evidence or any empirical study that shows us and or talks about all these various aspects from rationality, science, good lawmaking, racism, irrationality, poor politics, and non-science?
Well, I think my entire thesis covers that, to be honest.
Are these all the conclusions that you draw, therefore,
Yes.
in your thesis?
Yeah.
Can you take us where?
Can I take you to places where I specifically discuss rationality, reason, science?
We need to find where you draw these conclusions in your thesis.
I draw this conclusion throughout the thesis. It's impossible to point to one specific place. And I say that because I consider the ethnopsychiatry and the social Darwinism and the debates around the prohibition of cannabis to exhibit throughout irrationality, racism, poor politics, etc. And through the discrediting of those theories of social Darwinism, ethnopsychiatry, of the racial hierarchy and the moral connections to it, I think that by today's standards it is not rational, reasonable, scientific. It was not good lawmaking by today's standards. But I don't think I could take you to specific places throughout, but that's because these are the central themes that are brought out throughout those chapters.
But remember, Mr. Patterson, we're talking about historical study. We're not talking about today's standards. We're talking about you being a historian,
Yes.
drawing these conclusions as a
Yeah.
historian.
Yeah.
Hence, I need you to refer me to where you draw these conclusions as a historian and on the basis of history.
That was my entire submission this morning. Unless you would like to repeat that whole
Please.
process.
I just need you to draw me specifically to where you make these conclusions as a historian.
Where I did explicitly state these conclusions, I've
Thank
got no
you.
idea.
No, it's fine. We'll pass that, Mr.
All right.
Mr. Patterson. Now, I would like us to go to page 845.
845. All right?
Particularly at the second paragraph, just before the paragraph above 2.1.16.
Okay.
You say there, well, you quote, the native view that there is nothing reprehensible about Dagga smoking in itself.
Mm-hmm.
It said has not been changed by the fact that the law of the white man now forbids the practice.
Yes.
Now, I need to understand if this is your view. Is this, are you expressing a view of, I see you've quoted it?
Oh, no, that's a quote.
Of course,
That's a
but I
quote.
need to know whether you agree with this quote as your own, would you adopt it as your own view?
Well, no, I think it's a fairly racist quote. I wouldn't adopt it as my own view.
It's a fairly racist quote.
Well, yes. It was written by a racist government, and the context in which it was placed was someone pointing out that despite white people having forbidden the practice, yet the native, as it was classified then, still found there was nothing morally reprehensible about it. I don't think I can adopt that view, not as it stands as a quote. I certainly wouldn't adopt any view that was explicitly stated in the context of the Interdepartmental Committee on the Abuse of Dagga.
Now, I'm going to tie that to paragraph 2.1.18.
Okay.
And I'll read that into the record. It says, internationally, certain Southern African strains of cannabis became famous and in high demand.
Mm-hmm.
The flourishing of these strains and the enormous growth of the Southern African cannabis trade in general was largely due to an unintended consequence of the apartheid regime.
Mm-hmm.
In that, the apartheid regime removed control over vast areas of land through the Bantustan system, whereby many rural areas were then free to cultivate large traces of cannabis.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this particular paragraph, you are saying that once there was apartheid, the land was taken away from the Bantustans. And consequently, in fact, before then, the very same land the Bantustan used to use to cultivate cannabis in large quantities. Am I understanding you to say that?
No, I think you're simplifying it a lot. You speak about apartheid as if it was one thing, and it unfolded over time. So when apartheid didn't just appear, it was a way of thinking. So there were different laws that were implemented over time. There was a grand apartheid plan that they wanted to implement, which included giving kind of nominal independence to the different Bantustans.
Let's focus on what the statement says. You're saying
Okay.
once there was apartheid in South Africa.
I don't say once there was apartheid.
No, well, let's look at the consequence of apartheid, as you said.
Okay.
The consequence of apartheid included, amongst others, land being taken away from the blacks.
No, but I'm not referring to that land.
You're not referring to what?
I'm not referring to the land that was taken away. I'm referring to the Bantustan system
Okay.
and the land within the former Bantustan.
Can we read this again?
Excuse
Mr.
me,
President?
ma'am, but I think in fairness to the witness, you're putting up something to the witness that is not in this paragraph by saying that it says that that land was taken away from the Bantustans or from the blacks. It's talking about, it speaks about in that the apartheid regime removed control over vast areas of land through the Bantustan system. So perhaps you're misunderstanding that portion. I just want to alert you to that.
Thank you. I'm indebted to your Lordship. But, my Lord, what I'm trying to do, Mr. Peterson, we are saying that vast amounts of land was removed from the Bantustans.
No, we're not.
Okay, let's go back. Sorry. Let's read this again. It says, in the apartheid regime, removed control over vast areas of land through the Bantustan system.
Yes. So what I'm saying is that through the implementation of the Bantustan system,
Yes.
the apartheid government itself no longer had control of vast areas of land that they had given to the Bantustan.
You're saying that the apartheid regime itself did not have the land. The apartheid government did not have
I'm
land.
saying that when let's go back a bit then. Let's say before the Bantustan system was established, the central state, the apartheid state, would have had control over areas of land, correct? Now, when they turn a certain area of land into a Bantustan, they are removing the control that they have over that land and giving it to the Bantustan governments. That's what I'm saying.
Effectively, then they lost land. That's what you're saying.
Lost control over
Control
land.
of the land.
Yeah. Look,
Now
it
let-
was nominal independence, I'll give you that, but the direct control that they had over the land was removed from them, yes.
Let's finish that sentence. It says, whereby many rural areas were then free to cultivate large tracts of cannabis.
Yes?
Who? Can you try and explain that to us, please?
Well, that has a lot to do with the social context as well. These were very poor areas that the apartheid state would have gone into and prevented the cultivation of cannabis, now that the apartheid government was no longer interested in looking after these areas, or at least removed the responsibility for those areas. Then it meant that the people who were there had a far weaker state overseeing them, if you could call it a state at all in some cases. So when I say that they were free to cultivate large tracts of land, I mean that a very strong centralized state that would have prevented them from doing so wasn't there to prevent them from doing so anymore.
Do you have any evidence of this information that you're giving us here? Is there
Yes,
something that we can refer to here?
Well, let's have a look at my reference list here in the thesis.
Thank you.
I believe you could look at Streak B and Wicksteed R, 1981. They published a book called Render unto Kaiser, a Transkei dossier. This is on 987, Lord.
9.
87.
You're referring to the authors there.
I'm referring to a book published by Streak and Wicksteed called Render unto Kaiser, a Transkei dossier. It was published in 1981. And in that book, they have a chapter on the cannabis industry in the Bantustan of Transkei. And I think that they argue very well for this very point.
So this is not your view then?
Well, it's my view in that I agree with them.
Okay. Now, let's go back to African culture.
Okay, where are we referring to?
No.
Or just in general?
Let's leave that
Okay.
part. Let's go to how you deal with the issue of African culture and how, because of apartheid and racism, that people have now, black people, have now been disenfranchised. Now, I must say, when I was reading your thesis, I could not come across a particular black culture that you refer to.
That's true, I don't refer to it. Not any specific culture, but then that wasn't my focus. My focus was on the cannabis plant and prohibition.
Indeed, you speak about the black culture.
I don't believe
And,
I do refer to specific black cultures.
That's my point. You have not been telling us of
Or
any, you have
to-
not told us of any specific culture where black
no,
people
but
have
that
been
wasn't the
disenfranchised.
point of the study.
Mr. Patterson, you can't hear me when we speak at the same time. I must finish my point and then you can answer me.
All right?
My issue is in your thesis, you do not refer us to a single black ethnic group that has been disenfranchised, correct?
Well, I would say that all black ethnic groups have been disenfranchised. That was the process of colonialism and apartheid.
We're talking about cannabis.
Yes, we are. You're right.
Now, you accept that you have not referred us to a single culture.
Yes.
Now, let's then continue and see and test this theory. You say that the smoking of cannabis is African culture.
No, I wouldn't say it's an African culture. I'd say that the evidence indicates that when European society got here, they found that it was widely available and widely used. That doesn't mean that its social acceptance didn't change over time in different areas and obviously with different ethnic groups and cultures. But I wasn't really looking at the cultures per se. I was just trying to establish the social use. Yeah, I wouldn't call it a part of African culture. I would say it's been used for a long time in Africa and in different ways. Sometimes it might have been included as a part of African cultural systems of one description or another, but by and large, it wasn't what I was talking about, and it wasn't where I was going to go.
Mr. Peterson, my understanding of your thesis is that the smoking of cannabis was part of African culture. Are you saying that is not what you meant to take out in your thesis?
I don't think that we would be speaking about the same things when we say African culture.
We have not even gone into African culture yet, but I'm saying what you are saying in your thesis is that smoking of cannabis was part of African culture.
No, it wasn't.
So you're saying what you said is not what you meant, or am I?
Well, perhaps it would help if a learned friend pointed the witness to where he says
I will refer the witness, my lord. Yes. If I may just be given indulgence, I'll refer the witness at a later stage, not immediately.
Yes.
I'll just need to draw that reference. Now, you are saying to us, therefore, that the smoking of cannabis was purely practice, and it was not...
Sorry, purely?
He's saying that it was purely... I'm referring to the statement he made earlier.
Yes, I missed the word. Purely?
Practice.
Oh, practice.
How
it was just what people used to do.
It was widely used, would be how I would put it.
Okay.
But that shouldn't be taken to imply that there weren't taboos against it in certain times and in certain places. Its degree of acceptance would have varied over time. Its presence would have been a constant.
Okay. I just want to get you to give me a simpler way of referring to this, because we are saying it's not African culture, it is not practice, but it was widely used.
I would prefer to put it like that, yes. Yeah.
Do you have any idea of at least the statistics of people who used cannabis? For example, we could say 20 million, 15 million, 3 million, 2 million people. How many people historically, according to your own thesis, were the wide users of cannabis?
Well, I guess first I should clear it up. Which period are you talking about here?
We are still talking about the historical times.
The pre-colonial?
Pre-colonial times.
Oh, there's
because
absolutely no way of knowing. There were no censuses conducted. We don't even know how many people there were.
So we have no evidence of how many people were using it. We just know that it was widely used.
Yes. Or at least all evidence indicates that it was widely used.
Well, when we say evidence, you must refer to that evidence.
Yeah, but that evidence isn't statistics. That evidence is ethnographic reports. So you would have different traders sometimes, these European explorers that would go across Africa, and that was happening throughout the 17th and 18th century, 19th centuries, 18th and 19th mainly. And during that time they would write about what they saw, the various places that they went to, and their accounts of cannabis use in those different areas gives an indication that there was extensive use.
But have you referred us to those statistics particularly?
There are no statistics, I said that. Those statistics don't exist.
There's no statistics?
Of course not. There was no census carried out in pre-colonial Africa that we have records of today.
Okay. Now we are saying after you know, within our now democratic lifetime, 20 or so years,
Yes.
how many people, roughly, widely use cannabis?
I've got no idea, and I don't really trust the statistics on it. People would, like, just asking someone if they use it or don't use it, how are we meant to know if they're telling the truth? It being illegal, it being a criminal act, people would be quite likely lie about it. I wouldn't feel comfortable saying any number.
My Lord, I've been cautioned about time.
Do you still have a way to go with the witness? Do you still have a number of questions?
I
or-
do have a number of questions for the witness.
You
yes.
do?
Absolutely, madam.
Yes. But then we'll adjourn until... Court is not sitting tomorrow, as I was advised by counsel in chambers. So, the position be, will this witness continue on Wednesday then?
And the idea is that Professor Nutt will return for Wednesday and Thursday.
Yes.
This witness will return on Friday.
That's the... So you will be excused in the meantime until Professor Butt completes his testimony between hopefully Wednesday and Thursday.
Lord, might I inquire, while I'm on my feet, Lord, again as to the starting time, both for Wednesday, Thursday and for Friday, if your Lordship is able to give us some indication at this point. I don't mean to pressurize your Lordship, but simply to try and arrange our movements.
Yes. I seem to have found last week, when we start earlier, then we had to take an earlier break for tea because then the witness is tired out, and that's, I'm not sure that was such a good idea about starting every day half an hour earlier from Tuesday to Friday in order to accommodate a Friday early adjournment.
Yes.
It's creating its own problem, I think, in terms of the length of time that the witnesses are in the box in the morning. We need to work on that. We could still start at 9:30 tomorrow.
On Wednesday.
I mean on Wednesday, sorry. And but maybe this Friday and the following Friday, there are 2 Fridays to go. Instead of adjourning at 1 o'clock, there are 1 or 2 options. The one is to, but again, if you continue through lunch, we're back to the same problem I just highlighted, is to adjourn at 3 o'clock instead of 4 o'clock. And that 1 hour can be made up in the form of 15 minutes on each day.
Perhaps we should just play it by ear, as it were, my Lord.
Yes. So for now, we will resume on Wednesday at 9:30.
As the court pleases.
Court adjourned.